Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see people here today. My name is Linda Rugg, and I'm a professor in the Scandinavian department at UC Berkeley. The film we're going to show here today is part of a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Ingmar Bergman's birth. And as I've told you, if you've been here before, many of you I think have been here before, this is also a special presentation because we have a combination of my undergraduate class and the public. And so the way that we usually conduct this is that I give an introduction to the film, and then we watch the film, and then I excuse my undergrads because they will watch it tomorrow. I'm sorry, not to watch it tomorrow, they'll discuss it tomorrow. And then we have a discussion with the audience. This time we have a special treat for you. So it's going to be just a little bit different. I am going to introduce the film, and then we are going to watch the film, but we have a special guest today. Katinka Fargo has come to us from Sweden. She was a long-term collaborator and co-worker with Ingmar Bergman, starting already in the 1950s when she was a young girl, and continuing on to the end of his film career in 1982 and even further. But Fanny and Alexander was his big film to end his career, and then there were a couple of projects afterwards. So Katinka's here, and she's one of the people who is perhaps best able in the world to speak about the nuts and bolts of Bergman's work, really. Katinka was behind the scenes for these films. She worked as a script supervisor, and as she's told me, this is the same thing, a continuity engineer supervisor. And then she also worked as a production manager for some of his films. And so she has a broad experience. She knows Bergman and his actors and his technicians, the Swedish film world. And she went on then to become a producer of films in her own right. And so we're very happy and privileged to have Katinka here with us. And so what is going to happen today is after the film production, my students don't have to leave if they don't want to. And Katinka will join me here on stage. She's going to tell us a little bit about the production of this film, and then we'll have a conversation, and we'll ask you to join the conversation with questions that you might have, either about this film or more broadly about her work with Ingmar Bergman. So this is your big chance to ask somebody who actually knew Bergman. and so we wanted to welcome Katinka here today. So just to introduce you briefly to the film that we're about to see, a lot of times I begin these introductions by talking about the title of the film. Because titles are often translated, and sometimes they're translated quite differently from the original. It happens that the Swedish title for this film is nearly almost the same as the English title. The Swedish title of the film is Skammen, which means the shame. But there's a subtle difference between shame and the shame, right? So it seems to point to a particular shame, a shame that is attached to warfare, violence, and the resulting diminishment of human integrity. Originally, the working title was Kriget, or The War. But interestingly, the film is not about a particular war. Shame was filmed in 1967, released in 1968, and was undoubtedly made in response to the Vietnam War in part, which was an intense point of controversy and protest in Sweden as early as 1965. The Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, who was subsequently, unfortunately, assassinated in the 1980s, Olof Palme spoke out strongly against the war, and in particular America's involvement in the war. From the beginning, he was speaking out against it, and in 1972, he equated the bombing of Hanoi with war crimes in the Second World War, which caused the United States to freeze diplomatic relations with Sweden for a time. Swedish protests against the war and American imperialism made their way into the art and films of the period in Sweden. And Bergman was harshly criticized by some people for his lack, what was perceived as his lack of political engagement. It was sort of expected of people that they be fully engaged with the politics of the time. In the 60s and 70s, he was accused of clinging to his bourgeois roots, of self-involvement and unhealthy obsessions. And he felt the impact of these attacks, I think, and he later wrote in his autobiography, The Magic Lantern, "It is possible that some brave researcher will one day investigate just how much damage was done to our cultural life by the 1968 movement. It is possible, but hardly likely." That's the end of quote. So it was in this cultural climate in Sweden that he made this film. But if you're expecting something like Saving Private Ryan or Full Metal Jacket, you're going to be disappointed. There's some gunfire and bombing, but they're not the big scale pyrotechnic effects that we've become used to in our time. And I think Katinka might be able to speak about the pyrotechnics. Bergman is not interested in pyrotechnics that much, and he's also not really interested in party politics. There's no explicit condemnation of imperialism or capitalism or communism or fascism. This is a film, not surprisingly, when you think it's a Bergman film, that speaks about what happens to the souls of human beings when they live in a world at war. What happens to culture? What happens to art? What happens to friendship, to marriage? What happens to our own concept of who we are as people? Bergman writes about this film, quote, "At the moment the physical violence ends and the inner violence begins, shame becomes a good film. When society stops functioning, the main characters lose their point of reference. Their social relationships cease. They stand there helpless. Everything glides into a dream play that ends in the boat filled with refugees. Everything is told in pictures, like a nightmare. In the world of nightmares, I was at home. In the reality of war, I was lost." During my work on the manuscript, my title was "The Dreams of Shame." That's the end of the quote. There are more actors, more people in this film than there usually are in a Bergman film. He needed people to make up a crowd in the scene where the people are rounded up, for one thing. So there are more extras and there are more people. But as in most Bergman films, the main action centers around just a few people. Jan Rosenberg and his wife, Eva, who are orchestra musicians played by Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann. Just last week, we saw Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann as a married couple again, also filmed on an island in The Hour of the Wolf. So the focus is once again in part on their relationship and the way in which the dark forces of the world impact them, though this time the dark forces are brought on by war. The third person who occupies our attention is the mayor of the town, who is also later a military officer, who is played by Gunnar Björnstrand. Bergman often puts von Sydow and Björnstrand opposite one another as antagonists in his films, where von Sydow can be a kind of an idealist, like the knight in The Seventh Seal, or a dreamer or a magician, as he is in The Magician, or an artist, as he was in Hour of the Wolf and also in this film. And Björnstrand is a hardened skeptic, or a realist, or a cynic. And here, in this film, that antagonism reaches its ultimate and perhaps logical conclusion. There is an actor I have to name with a small but poignant part who is not really known in the United States, but he is a towering figure in Swedish popular culture. And this is Hasse Alfredson, who plays the owner of an antique shop. Alfredson was best known in Sweden for his comedy work. So when we see his predicament in shame, and you see his sorrow, it's particularly moving, I think, for many Swedes who enjoyed his comedy. Outside of his comic hours, though, Alfredson, the person, was a critic of National Socialism and far-right movements, and he wrote a novel in the 1990s that imagines what would have happened if the Nazis invaded Sweden during the Second World War. He belonged to an anti-extremist group called Artister mot Nazister, Artists Against Nazis. There are no explicit Nazis in this film. There are no explicit Americans. There's no explicit anything. We have no idea why the fighting is taking place and what either side believes or wants. The sides are indistinguishable from one another and speak the same language. Is it a civil war? One might argue that all wars are civil wars in the sense that they pit brother and sister against brother and sister. We learn as much about the war as Jan and Eva do, trying to get a signal on their radio, their broken radio. And Eva says, and this is one of the more beautiful quotes from the film, quote, "Sometimes it's as if everything is a dream. It's not my dream. It's someone else's, and I have to be in it. How do you think it will be when the dreamer wakes up and feels ashamed?" That's the end of the quote. This is Bergman's dream of war, his nightmare of war, his nightmare of shame. The final scene, an unforgettable one, calls to mind the refugee crisis that we are experiencing today in the Mediterranean. The dream, in other words, in the end, is not that much different from reality. So, we'll watch Shame together. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the film together, and then we'll give you a chance to ask questions if you have some questions. This is Katinka Fargo, whom I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And she was telling me just now it's been a long time since she saw this film, and so she was a little shocked. As were some of us as well. We're going to wait just a second, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions. When we do start to ask questions, then we'll send microphones around because this is going to be recorded as usual. So we'll need to have you'll need to have the microphone before you say something. Okay. So Katinka, maybe you wanted to say a few words about the work on this film and what it was like. You don't know what it was like to make it.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember that it was such a tough film all the way through. It was. We did this in 1967, between September and December, and at that point, you see, we didn't have any special effects that they have today. This is not difficult to do today, all the firing and the bombing and we had two people, one who was an expert in fireworks, and the other one was the military, all military, and they had all these explosive on top. We lived in small houses, in the summer houses, in this island, and on top of one house, these two men lived, and all the explosive was in the attic. We were very afraid of that. I think it looks fantastic for being so primitively made. This house we built there with loose walls, so we could act as if it was a film studio. Could move around the walls, and the greenhouse. Everything was built on the spot. We were never in the studio. We did the whole film down there. What should I say?
I was thinking about the people in the film also because, as I said earlier, there were a lot of more people than you would usually have in a Bergman film. So the film was made on Gotland, on this island on Fårö, the small island north of Gotland where Bergman lived, also, right? Yes. And did you get people from the village, or what did you?
All the extras are from the village. He was that was the same year as he moved to the to the island, and people were very keen about him so that he would like the island. People were very sweet, the farmers and the fishermen and whatever who lived on the and they are all in the film.
And do you think that some of the people who were involved in the film, that they had memories of the Second World War? Of course, Sweden was not involved. Sweden was neutral during the Second World War, but it seems like some of the film tries to recall not the Vietnam War as much as it does the Second World War.
You see, I don't see this film as a war film. I mean, on the surface, yes. But it's more about what does war do to us? People, people on the floor, people, normal people, what does it do to us? I think it shows that very well. Do you agree about that?
Yes. I mean, I mentioned that in my introduction. I think that what Bergman is much more interested in is how do we change?
Exactly.
And we see this big change, right, with the couple where she starts out and she's, this practical, getting it done, and she has to drag him around, and he has a toothache, and
he is no hero.
No, he is absolutely no hero. And so she's the one who's the leader in their relationship, and then at a certain point, he begins to take over and become very brutal.
Yeah. That he steals that money is very tough, I think. It's difficult to follow that so quickly. He changes into a villain. I mean, it's
yes. Suddenly he changes into a villain. I mean, do you think? But I think it's interesting that Bergman seems to his change into a villain, and I think he does do that, has to do more with his wife cheating on him.
Absolutely.
Than it has to do with the war. I mean, the war is, of course, very important.
Jealousy is so angry, and it's incredible what she does with this man in the house, or in the greenhouse. But anyway, I mean, it's their property.
But don't you have the feeling? Okay, so there's this mixture between the personal and the war, right?
Yes.
So this man who was the mayor, and now he is some kind of leader. It's
in some wrong opposition, probably.
We don't know. We have no idea.
No.
Okay, so that's one of the things about the film, is that it doesn't give us a lot of information. But because he's in a position where he could send them to a work camp.
Yes.
Then she feels that she needs to sleep with him, probably, right?
And she has done that before.
She has done that before. So one imagines that it's not because she's having an affair with him. It's not that she's in love with him. No, she feels she's using him and he's using her, and they're using each other. And then even this very terrible scene where they're sitting at the table drinking together, and already he's sort of seducing her in front of her.
The thing is that these actors are so good. I think it's amazing how wonderful they are, and what Liv Ullmann does in this film is unbearable. I mean, it's she was so young here, and
she maybe was only 25 or 6, something like that.
Something 80. She's 80 today. I don't know what.
If we go back and subtract, but
mathematics.
She was it was probably 25, something like that, right? 26. So she's very young. And what she needs to do in this film, yes, it's quite horrible. But also what Max von Sydow has to do in the film is also quite horrible. But then when he shoots Gunnar Björnstrand, you have you have the sense that it could be an act of revenge for the affair, right? I mean, he's forced to do it.
It's about, really. It's not the war. It's not
the war.
It's jealousy. It's money. It's under the cover of this fantastic, terrible war.
Yeah. So
I know that the film was so tough. I have forgotten.
Yeah, this is one of the
51 years ago. So
it's 51 years since you saw it the last time. Was it 51 years ago? Did you see it last 51 years ago?
No, I I probably have seen it sometime, but a long time ago.
A long time ago.
I don't remember. It was so tough.
Yeah, this is one of the things about Bergman. If you see a whole series of Bergman films, you realize how tough Bergman
This one
actually.
is, yes.
Well, this one is, but then we're going to have Cries and Whispers next time. So it's not going to get any better.
At least that's very beautiful.
Oh yeah, it's very
That
beautiful.
I saw the other week, and it's fantastic. It's so beautiful. It's not,
It
these
is.
actresses. But there is a scene when they pass a burning barn,
Yes. Yes.
and we use napalm
Oh.
to fire the
Napalm.
and we have a documentary somewhere where you see Bergman jumping up and down. He's so happy, it's burning like hell, and he screams, "More napalm, more napalm!" And the Vietnam War was going on at the same time, so it was a little strange. It was a little sort of, but and also another stupid memory. In the end, with all these dead people on the sea, they were dolls, of course, except a couple of divers, a couple of people. Bergman was so excited. We were out in the Baltic with a small rowing boat. We too, and and he was having this loudspeaker and fussing around with that loudspeaker and came down on one of those dolls, and the doll sort of turned up his face and said, "I'm a living dead." The strange memories.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it's a very strange. I mean, that scene was actually, interestingly, when I was introducing the film, that was the scene that I thought was the last one. Right? In my memory, I stopped the film at that moment when they're stuck among all of the dead bodies, and it doesn't look. But then it goes to another scene where the sea is open again, and then she tells about her dream. Yeah. Yeah. So she tells about someone else's being in someone else's dream, and then she tells about her own dream, and that's the actual end. But it's interesting that when I remember the film, I remember the dead bodies. You did too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This beautiful dream, I have no idea about that.
No. I had totally forgotten about the beautiful dream, because there's something so horrifying about them stuck in the sea, not able to get.
Will they really survive? Do you
Yes.
think they survive?
Well, you're shown that they use the very last of their water. You know, they have that big container of water, and they pour out the very last, and then they're in the middle, and because this. I mean, you and I know that this is the Baltic, and it's probably not that far, maybe, to land, but
Enough far, I can tell you.
Well, it would take a while to row. It would take you a long time to row there.
Had the big ferry as a station with all the lights and all the things. We had it on the ferry, and when we came back in the afternoon, then the wind started to blow so hard, so we couldn't get the ferry into land. So they had to have ropes in the end and tow it into. So it was very dramatic.
Okay, so it was a little bit scary making the film also sometimes, and the fires were kept under control.
Oh yes,
yeah.
Yes, but the people in Fårö, they were a little afraid of us.
Yeah, I think that I would be in for it too if you were there.
Terrible
airplanes. Mm-hmm.
They were real.
They looked like Swedish military airplanes, yeah. Because Sweden makes military airplanes. The Saab company, SAAB, Saab, that you may know for making cars, was actually originally an airplane making company. So the name of it is Sveriges Aeroplan, Aktiebolaget, Sweden's airplane company. So they still make military planes. So Sweden does have its own military planes. Yeah. But one of the scenes that strikes me very much when I watch the film again now is when they destroy the house. So they said they're going to look for the money, but they're not really looking for any money. They're just completely destroying the house, right? Yeah.
That was more important to them,
Yeah.
I suppose. Yes.
And how was that to make that scene? Did they just have, they just went crazy and destroyed everything?
It destroyed it. I mean,
that was their order, direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, to just break everything in the house.
And we burnt it down, as you can see.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the very few Swedish films that I've ever seen that does this kind of destruction, especially from this earlier time.
Yeah.
Right? What did people think about it in Sweden when it was released? Do you remember?
There was a big, as I remember it, it was a big discussion about Vietnam, going on. And there were a certain Swedish author in Sara Lidman. She was very angry with him because of his political standpoint or not standpoint.
Not having a standpoint, yeah.
So there was some fighting about this film. It wasn't only popular.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the objections, of course, to the film is the fact that it doesn't take sides in terms of a country or a nation or even a political system. It doesn't, as you could see in the film. I mean, there's some references, I think, to totalitarianism, in some way with this idea of a dictator, but it's really there's no specific reference. And what people really wanted was...
You don't really know.
Yeah, you don't know. And what people in Sweden really wanted at the time was coming down hard against the American involvement in Vietnam.
We had big demonstrations, and everybody who had an opinion must demonstrate against Vietnam. And Palme, Olof Palme was very strong there, and it was a strong opposition against it.
So when Bergman didn't say anything about Vietnam in this war, then it was a reason to criticize the film, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And the woman you mentioned, Sara Lidman, she was a famous author, and she actually went to Hanoi, and she wrote a book about...
But it's a tough film.
It is a very tough film. It's a critique of war, right? Maybe should we give the audience a chance to ask us some questions? Yes, so we're going to give you a chance to make comments or questions now. I have someone way up there. I had someone down here earlier. He's still... someone down here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
One of the bright notes in the film, and this is true of Hour of the Wolf too, is that it's got a musical sub-theme. So Hour in the Wolf is full of Mozart, and in this film, it's kind of out of nowhere. They're talking about Dvorak and things, and it's true in lots of Bergman's movies. There's a musical element, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
But music was extremely important to Bergman. And he uses very much the same music in many films. And I was in his house a couple of months ago, and the library of music that he has in his bookshelves, it's fantastic. It's everything. And he was very knowledgeable about music, and used it very much in his private life. So it's an important part of Bergman and his work is music.
I mean, in this film, there actually is almost no actual music. They are musicians, and I think it's probably precisely the fact that the violin is destroyed and the piano is destroyed and they're no longer able to play that is one of the great war crimes in Bergman's mind, that the music is silenced. And, the one time I remember is when Max von Sydow he said, I dreamt I was playing the Brandenburg, the fourth movement of the Brandenburg, and then he hums it a little bit, and that's like the only music almost in the film, right? Or the music box. He plucks on the violin, and then there's the music box, which is when Hasse Alfredson has this little Meissen music box, And that whole scene, I mean, I was mentioning this in my introduction because for me it's very moving to see Hasse Alfredson in this film because he,
But it wasn't Hasse Alfredson from the beginning, you see. It was an old actor from from Gothenburg. But he was quite confused. So son, he comes in on stage and comes into his shop, this old man, and suddenly Sven Nykvist said, "Where is he?" He couldn't keep the scenery. So we had to say, "Thank you very much," and send for Hasse Alfredson instead. And this man, he was so sweet, but he didn't remember the scenery given, you see. So it was so strange when Sven Nykvist looked under he always had a cloth
over his head on the camera.
Where is he?
Oh, I see. I'm interested to hear that. So I have someone here, and there was someone up there also. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, hi.
We'll have someone here.
First off, thank you for being here and for contributing to making this wonderful film. I had a question. Anytime dealing with fire during a production, it's quite a big problem. Tarkovsky famously had a problem with it during The Sacrifice, which kind of reminiscence the burning down scene in this film, also shot by Mr. Nyquist. And I was wondering if during the moments when you don't really have a lot of chances for a lot of takes and everybody kind of has to perform as the decorations and everything is burning down, what was the mood on set? Because I know Bergman usually liked to keep the set pretty loose and everybody would be joking around, but I was wondering during those intense moments when performing as the camera was rolling was important.
Just a second. So
They have no choice.
they just have to work.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I was
They've
just
read the script. They know what's going to happen. So no, it's good. We have always very good security around people, and that we don't see on the screen. But there is firemen, and there is whatever is needed around. So it's no danger.
Yeah, it's true. Although there was one bad thing that happened with Fanny and Alexander, right?
Yes.
Because they had so in Fanny and Alexander there was an actor who actually has to be set on fire.
Yes.
And they, I think,
it was a stuntman.
There was a stuntman in Fanny and Alexander.
It was something with that the covering of his hands wasn't enough, so he's burnt his hands, and he comes out of this room and he makes a lot of sound, and we didn't understand that he was asking for help. You see, it was very strange.
Yeah,
but that was
just one time.
Really misfortune I can remember in all these years. I mean, that was a little his own fault. We hired a stuntman who was supposed to be a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I have someone down here. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. And I would just like to, I'm a pianist, and one of the things that fascinated me about Bergman from the very beginning was, how he used the Bach. He uses Bach all the time. He used the Bach cello suite in one of the early films. Now, I spent about 3 minutes of the film trying to recall the little musical fragment that he played on the keyboard. Bum priadam bum pa 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 bum pa 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 bum bum priadam bum. It's one of the dances from the third partita, which this comes after. Remember, Bjornstrand says, "Here, I can give you these scores of Dvorak, and I have nothing against Dvorak. I'm Czech myself too, so I don't have. I like Dvorak's music, but it was a bribe. It was another level. When Bergman uses Bach, this is heartbreaking, because Bach to him is like a deity. And when that comes through, it is like when Max von Sydow talks about the violin that's from the time of Beethoven, and you really feel that Bergman knows and cares about this great classical German culture. Now, one of the things about Bergman that moved me most was when he admitted that when Hitler came to power in the beginning, he didn't see it as an evil right off the bat. Am I mistaken about that? I remember him actually being able to admit that he was unable to see at the very beginning how evil this was.
No, this is true.
And he uses Hitler's voice at the beginning of the film.
On the radio, yeah. There's a mixture. There's a sort of you did pick up Hitler's voice. There's a medley of voices at the beginning of American and Russian, German, and Hitler's voices there. The thing about Hitler and Bergman, which he talks about in his autobiography, A Magic Lantern, was when he was a boy. I think he was 15. His family sent him to Germany as a kind of an exchange student, I want to say, or sort of just to live with another pastor's family. And this was, this was before the war. It was during the period when Hitler had come to power. There was a lot of enthusiasm, and the rallies and the parades and all this kind of thing. And he was a young man. He was a very, very young boy. And
he was a young boy, and we mustn't forget that Germany, before the war, was a cultural something in Sweden. It wasn't England, it wasn't France, it was Germany that had all the culture. That's why the young people were sent to Germany, not because they loved Hitler.
No, and it was, I think that, that was why, because it was a high culture. It was the first foreign language that Swedes were taught in school. So if you wanted to get your language skills down, you would be sent to Germany. Germany was also not only music, philosophy, but it was also science. Very, very important science. So, but you're quite right that when Bergman was there, and it was, okay, then I think that this is interesting in terms of this film also. Part of the reason he becomes captivated with Hitler is because he falls in love with this girl, or he becomes infatuated with a young girl who's part of the family. And he sort of wants to be part of everything. And so he realizes, he gets carried away and does the Hitler salute and is very much a part. And it's not until subsequently that he realizes that this was such a terrible thing, yeah.
He didn't agree later. I mean, no.
Oh, okay. You have to wait until you have a microphone because you're being recorded.
I grew up. I was drafted for the Vietnam War. I grew up with all of that, and we had to see the error of our own country. Yeah. And so I was very moved when Bergman said, because we all love the German culture. All of us growing up playing Beethoven and Bach.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
So
you noticed it in this.
So,
film. Okay.
God, yes. I mean, and that's what this is. This is an identification, the fact that everyone has the capability of doing good, doing great good. You feel the humanity of both of the main characters of the film, and you also see their anger and their hatred toward each other.
Yeah.
Towards each other.
Yeah. At the end, they're converted to that. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's true. There's a sort of a change. I have somebody up in that first row there. Yeah.
I just had a quick question about Bergman's work in general. You had the great opportunity to work a lot with him as he transitioned from what he had written in the scripts to what he then directed, since he wrote and directed almost all of his films. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what his scripts were like, if they were very descriptive and elaborate, or if they were very sparse, and how much of his imagery was created after the writing process, and how much had he already written down before he started filming?
It was very much detailed. You could certainly understand what was going to happen and what was going on. He was a fantastic writer. Today there is somebody in Swedish in the Bergman Stiftelse,
The Bergman Foundation.
the Bergman Foundation, who thinks that his opinion is that perhaps was Bergman a better writer than a filmmaker. So that's also a point of view.
And some of the scripts, if you read them, they're almost like novels. Yeah.
And it's not the conventional left side, right side dialogue on this side and the happenings. And it's like a novel. Good novel, always.
And he describes the characters. He describes, their psychology. So you know what's happening inside their heads also.
Which is a
in some of the
fantastic
scripts.
help to the actors. They know from the beginning what they're up to and what they were supposed to do. What they're supposed to be. Yes.
I have some people here. You have back up there? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Two quick questions. One is on the dream at the end. I wonder if you could say anything more about interpreting that dream. And then secondly, so many details of Bergman's films come out, and how much of it is really his personal experience versus interviewing people that would get such details? Thank you.
This is a man with fantastic imagination and fantasy. So I don't think you can get that personal with him. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that this comes out of his own imagination and his own fantasy. I certainly don't think he interviewed anybody. I think that it's possible that, in Sweden, after the end of the Second World War, and even towards the end of the Second World War, there were many refugees. You also were a refugee. Yes, yeah. And these people came into Swedish life, Swedish cultural life, and they had stories, and they brought their experiences with them. And so there wouldn't have been necessarily formal interviews, but the sort of knowledge of what people had experienced as refugees would have been part of what Bergman would know about. But then he creates the images, right? He creates the images and the feelings. So them trying to drive down this road, and there are dead bodies along the road, and then they are blocked and they have to go back. There's a dead child lying there at one point. These are all things that could have happened, did happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that little thing with the child is, they've been talking about having a child or not having a child 4 minutes ahead, and then comes this child. It's so moving, I think. It's so...
Yes, you can immediately, and so it becomes part of their psychological, their emotional story. These are real things. So you could say, okay, you could almost create a documentary about refugees and so on. But because it's linked back to this story about these two people that we hear and that we learn about, it gains more emotional significance. I think that he himself was not a refugee. He didn't experience this himself, but he's able to, as Katinka said, he's able to translate the experiences that people talked with him about, or that he was able to understand, into a film language, so that the viewer, as you said at the end of the film, you feel shocked, because it's very tough. It's because of this emotional impact of what the people are experiencing, right? So,
and also in Bergman's films, things hang together. It is logical that she sees that little girl after having talked about wanting a child or not wanting a child, and so there is that dead child. It all vad heter det, hänger ihop.
It all hangs together, and it makes into a web, a kind of a web of feeling and ideas, emotions, right? So, yeah.
And you often see that in his films, that it has links backwards and forwards to the story, which I think is often very beautiful.
Even when it's very terrible. And in this case, it was very terrible and very beautiful at the same time. I have someone up here, I have someone down here, I have someone there. Who has a microphone?
Speaking of beautiful, these films are always so beautifully shot. I'm wondering how much influence on set Sven Nykvist had in collaboration with Bergman.
Yeah. But they work together, I suppose you can say. I mean, Sven Nykvist was no idiot. He had his own word, and they discussed things. They came together on the result.
Yeah, you know, Katinka, I don't know, I think maybe I told you about this. Have you ever seen the documentary film about Sven Nykvist?
Yes.
Ljuset håller mig sällskap.
Yes.
Light keeps me company. And do you remember there's a scene where Bergman and Nykvist are walking together holding hands? Yeah. And I'm always very struck by that scene because Swedish men don't normally hold hands. That's not something that is a common cultural practice. And it shows to me very much both how close they are to each other, and there's a kind of almost a childlike feeling about their friendship.
But Bergman always, or very often, was, what do you call it? When you've touched very much. Okay. That is a word for that.
Touchy.
No, it's a more beautiful word for it.
Okay, there's a more beautiful word. He's tactile. He likes to touch people. Yes.
Empathetic.
That's the emotional term, and then the physical term is actually touching other people. Yeah, yeah.
And he would take the actors by the hand and walk them through the scenery, and very often with hand holding and showing. Here you do this, and here you do that, and so hold them all the time.
Okay, I have someone there.
Yeah. Well, for clarification, I just saw this for the first time.
Louder.
A little louder?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay, just saw this for the first time. And so the fisherman, what was his name?
Philip.
Then he was the leader of one of the tribes.
Resistance.
Resistance.
I mean, whatever that means.
And then was he also the helmsman of the boat?
He's also on the boat. I don't know.
Well, he was the helmsman, I
we're,
think.
We're talking about the figure of Philip, who is he's a fishing. The first scene he catches fish. Johan hette Philip, yeah. Yeah, and then yes, that's his name. It's his real name. And then he later see him as the head of the resistance.
Yes.
And later he's on the boat.
On the boat.
Yes.
Well, he's on the boat. I thought he was the helmsman that took the money.
He took the money, yes.
Yeah, so he realizes that he had the
He's escaping.
He knows where that money comes from.
I understand.
The money, yeah.
He
realizes
he had the money, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
Then he also stripped the ring from the
He
female.
did, yeah.
Yeah.
He's trying to get money for the resistance, right? That's at least what he says, right? I mean, that's the pretext for wanting the money and for taking the ring. Yeah.
The ring is okay. It's not symbolic of something else.
Well.
And then he at the end he finally capitulates and goes over the side.
Fine. Yeah. He commits suicide. Yeah. I mean that the sort of ultimate. He apparently was somebody who believed in a cause. We're told he was the head of the resistance and so on. And then we see how he is escaping, and then we see how he commits suicide. So yeah, it's very bankrupt, everything that happens in the film. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. My question concerns the theater family, the film family, the theater family that I think you were part of. Did you feel like that you were part of a special group in working with Bergman, and how much of that was overlapped with his theater, and how I think of the Fanny and Alexander scene that we saw on Sunday, where one of the brothers is speaking to the theater company about his feelings of this family that he is part of. Is that Bergman's feelings towards the family that you were part of? I mean, was this a really important?
It's Bergman's feeling about the theater most of all.
And less so for cinema, or they overlapped?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it was very important to him to have the same group as much as possible, the same group, especially around the camera.
Okay.
On film after film. So we were a team that always worked with Bergman. Not always, but if possible, he wanted the same people around him. And the theater, I mean, he really loved the theater. And he used to say, the theater is my wife and the film is my mistress. That was one of his great sayings.
Right.
But it wasn't necessarily, when you're working on the film, a family feeling for you. It was more like a team feeling.
It was nice to meet again. But we worked on other films too. I mean, when we did Tarkovsky, we had also the Bergman team on the film, and we worked so well together. So we tried to keep it up. It's not always possible.
Yeah, I think that speech that you're referencing from Fanny and Alexander really, where Bergman tries to really encapsulate the idea of how he feels about the theater but I think that what's interesting about that too, if you think back to that speech, Oscar, he's the one who's speaking, he says, this theater is a little room where we shut off everything that's happening in the world outside, right? And create, the Swedish expression is ordning och reda. And it's just like this sense of order and peace and deliberation, purpose, right? So that Bergman is really interested in that. And in this film, you see how that gets destroyed for people.
I can see that.
Important to him with ordning och reda in life and in theater and in films, and everything should be in its place. He was
on time.
And that
he didn't want to improvise.
I think of his family life that's from afar seems so chaotic, that this world was a really special place for him that he went to, where everything was together.
But he lived like that. Everything should be at a certain place, at a certain time, at a certain way. He was very much like that.
But his love life and all of those relationships seem to be something quite different.
I don't know.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Okay.
There's a purpose to everything, right? Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but Katinka's also, you're commenting on what kind of personality he had and what kind of
That's what I mean.
Yes, yeah. And also, I mean, his daughter, Lynn Ullman, wrote a book about her parents. And did it get translated into English? What's it called in English? I can't remember. Yeah, but anyway, Lynn Ullman, she was the daughter of Liv Ullman and Ingmar Bergman, and she writes about living with her parents, and you can really see in that. I don't know if you've read that one. Did you read that one?
Yeah, I read that one.
Yeah, and she talks about how he wants to have everything.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Very organized.
I mean, you don't... In the films, we started sharp at 9 to shoot. Everybody had to be there, it had to be ready, it had to be lit, it had to be... And we had lunch sharp at 12, whatever happened. 12. Tea time, 2:45. Ending 4:30, at the most 4:45. I mean, it was very... I don't remember overtime with him. It was really... He didn't do that.
Yeah, he didn't do overtime, and then the films were shot in 40 days or something. 40
days, most of the films were 40 days. This one was 40 days, I think.
I have someone here. Then we should probably wrap up. We should probably stop.
Well,
Go ahead.
it's just a little more expansion on how much he changed. So he writes a novel type script, very detailed, everything as how it's to happen, the scenery, the shots, the dialogue. So you come to actually at 9 in the morning and you start filming. Is there too much spontaneity during the day where he says, let's do it this way instead of that, or the sun is setting over here, so I think we should, or is it pretty much, he had his conception before you even begin and he carried it out?
Yeah, but that was I mean, it comes to the situation. Well, of course, he could change his mind. I mean, he wasn't. He was such a professional. You see, he could sort of, but he was good on keeping his schedule, and he was. But within that, of course, he did things that we hadn't talked about or hadn't. I mean.
I think that it's very interesting to look at. There are a couple documentaries in which you can watch him work. And one of them was a documentary about Winterlight, about Nattvardsgästerna, Winterlight.
Yes, yes.
Ingmar Bergman makes a movie. It's called in English. And the other one that I think is very interesting to look at is the documentary on Fanny and Alexander.
Yeah.
Document Fanny and Alexander. And there you see him working with the actors. And he works with the boy who plays him as a boy, or he plays Alexander. And then he works with Stina Ekblad, the actress who, there's an actress who plays a man in Fanny and Alexander. And in those scenes, you have a strong feeling for how he gets the actors to perform, and also how he sets up the shots, and yeah.
There is a scene in the documentary of the magic flute.
Yes,
very
that
beautiful.
one's very good. Yeah.
When Tamino, he senses that is something wrong with the boy, the actor, the singer. So it's beautiful when he takes him like this, and what's the matter? And he walks away with him, holding him, and I thought that was very beautiful. He loved his actors, and of course, it was important to him that they felt well. And he could sense in miles if something was wrong. And then he took care of that in a very sweet way often.
I think we should wrap up because it's getting a little bit late now and people would like to go home. But I wanted to thank Katinka for being with us and sharing with us.